Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kerry Wang, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Searchlight. We have a great panel and conversation in store for you around hiring confidently without in-person interviews with Lynn from Confluent and Jackie from InVision. Our other panelist, Hope from InVision, was originally planning on joining us, but unfortunately, she's in the path of Hurricane Sally on the Gulf Coast right now, so let's all send her our best wishes. Before we jump into it, we do have a few housekeeping items. A word from our sponsors. So today's webinar is brought to you by Searchlight and Teamable. Searchlight is a talent data platform that gives companies the speed and analytics they need to make the best hires. We build high signal candidate profiles by standardizing and automating reference checks, which are a part of any gold standard hiring process. We take a scientific, software-driven approach to unlock insights on soft skills, team fit, and strengths. Recruiters and hiring managers save hundreds of hours, reduce unconscious bias, and fill in the gaps left by resumes and interviews. Teamable is an employee referral platform committed to making referral recruiting intuitive and fun. The Teamable app transforms employee social networks into dynamic talent pools that drive high employee engagement and make referring relevant candidates easy. Their intuitive workflows and powerful search functionality make it possible for recruiters to source passive candidates and immediately request warm email introductions from employees. All right, a few last notes about today's webinar. This presentation will be recorded and shared with all attendees and registrants. We want to make sure this conversation is as interactive as possible, so please submit questions for our panelists and we'll make every effort to save time at the conclusion of the webinar to get to them. And finally, once the thought leadership portion of our webinar concludes, you'll have the chance to stick around and see a brief demo of Searchlight and how our technology can help you implement some of the best practices on virtual recruiting that we're going to talk about. Now, without further delay, I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves. Jackie, let's start with you.
Great. It's so awesome to be here. I'm super excited to have this conversation today. My name is Jackie Velasquez-Ross, and I live in the Bay Area with my family. I work for InVision, where I lead product design, product management, and leadership searches for our teams. InVision is the digital product design platform that powers the world's best user experiences. So if you have a digital product, the things that you see on your screen are designed, right? So you can use our products and platform to design those experiences. And so I, along with my team, hire the amazing people that power that experience. We're a fully remote and distributed company. We've always been remote. We've always been distributed. And we've spent a lot of time kind of figuring out how that works. So again, super excited to share a little bit more about that today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. And Lynn?
Thanks, Kerry, and thanks so much for having me here today. I think it's going to be a really meaningful topic in the time of COVID to talk about interviewing remotely. My background is helping to hire for technology companies for the last 20 plus years, and most recently spent several years with Netflix helping to oversee the engineering hiring. And currently I oversee the executive and strategic search team, the mouthful, at Confluent. Confluent is the commercial platform for Kafka. So if there are any engineers here today with us, they will know Kafka. It is an event streaming platform that helps facilitate real-time data. And I've been there for about a year growing that team.
That's wonderful. I'm super excited for you both to share insights with everyone today. So let's jump into it. We all know that shelter in place and the switch to remote work has forced almost every corporate function to rethink how they do business. This has undoubtedly also been the case for talent and recruiting. So I'm excited to kick off our conversation here because we have two very different points of view from InVision and Confluent. Let's start with you, Jackie. InVision has been 100% remote from the start, by intention and by design. So in many ways, one might say that you all were built for this moment. Can you talk a bit about how the investments you've made already in remote recruiting have paid off for you? And what, if anything, has changed for InVision when our entire economy went remote?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and kind of thought. So yes, InVision has been 100% remote and fully distributed since the inception of our business, so for about 10 plus years now. Currently, we're able to legally and easily hire in the United States, Canada, Ireland, the UK, the Netherlands, Israel, and Australia. I have to remember that list. And so, yes, we have a globally distributed employee base. I think for us, not much has changed, to be very honest with you, with shelter in place and COVID-19, other than the fact that you can't move around as freely as you'd like in certain areas. Like, especially for us in the Bay Area, we can't go out to a coffee shop or go and, meet up with friends as easily. But for us, our day-to-day is on Zoom. We connect via Slack. We have an amazing relationship with Atlassian, and we use a lot of their tools for documentation, and we use our tools. We are a collaboration tool. So for us, our day-to-day is not different. In terms of talent, though, we have seen a shift. We've seen a major increase in people looking because of the effects of COVID-19 on the market. And on jobs. We've also seen, for us, it's been interesting to see other companies go remote and see how that has increased competition for us. And so we've had to get a lot smarter and move a little bit quicker to make sure that we are able to not only hire the best talent, but hire them quickly, because, hey, working remotely is kind of really cool now. And so yeah, but for us, it's not much has changed because, like you said, like, we are built for this.
And that's definitely a fortunate position to be in. But you said you have to move quicker, even with your probably more streamlined remote recruiting processes than other companies. So even on top of a already streamlined process, what have you been doing to help your team move quicker during this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So implementing software that can help us schedule quicker. So for the talent team's calls, like, scheduling I think is probably one of the biggest slowdowns for any talent organization, is getting in front of the camera and getting on the phone with a candidate. And so we've implemented new softwares to help us do that quickly. It's also partnering and being in lockstep with the business, our hiring managers, to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we were able to find the best candidate, get them in front of folks on Zoom, because we do all of our interviews on Zoom, and then get them signed and get them started at InVision.
Got it.
Yeah.
So, Lynn, let's jump to you. You've worked as a senior executive and technical recruiter at Netflix for over 4 years, and now you're at Confluent, focusing on executive recruitment, where 50% of the workforce is remote. Can you tell us a little bit about how Confluent has had to deal with the last 6 months?
Yeah, so it is a little bit different than Jackie leading what was always remote in COVID. However, Confluent has had a remote workforce. A good portion of the workforce has been remote. And so for us, it's a transition to having it all remote and having some employees not come into the office, right? Maybe for that final interview. But we have some fantastic process in place already, because if you had, 4, 5, 6 interviews, half of them probably would have been, over Zoom, anyway. Even if that person was in the office, they'd be connecting with someone that wasn't. And so it wasn't a fully in-person to fully remote. We have a lot of tools already at Confluent that are set up to really be able to engage with every facet, both with candidates as well as with employees, because it is, an important thing to engage your own employees when they're remote. And that starts before they're employees, right, in this interview process. So, but in terms of now being all remote, you know, what are we seeing? What are we thinking about differently? You know, I think that first and foremost, that you want to be very aware that candidates and interviewers are in stressful situations that they weren't in before. And so being very aware of that, and really being empathetic to the situation that someone could be in, right? That they could have a family member that's ill, that they might have small children with them during this interview, right? Or a dog, like I do outside of my office today, who wants to come in to this webinar, and really just try and use that as a point of human connection, because you know we're in interesting and difficult times, and also be aware that we actually have an opportunity to make it the best it can be, because you don't have to have 5 Zoom interviews in a row. And in fact, who would want that? And so, and being upfront at the beginning and sharing with candidates that, you know, we know this is maybe a little difficult for you to schedule around your family life or other obligations that you have. So tell us how it could be best for you. And, you know, maybe that's one interview over Zoom for 5 days instead of putting them together. And just being very flexible about how we can meet with this person and get the best interaction possible in a really stressful time.
That's absolutely the case, and I'm looking forward to diving a little bit deeper into both managing the stressful experience with both candidates and hiring managers later on in this conversation. But you did mention, Lynn, specifically being able to engage your employees even before their first day is super important. Before, you were able to fly people into headquarters sometimes, but now you can't do that at all. Have there been other ways that you've been able to showcase Confluence's culture without that in-person time?
So from the talent team's perspective, I think it's an opportunity to have more touch points with someone who's interviewing with your company. And, you know, you might have followed a process where you have one conversation at the beginning and one conversation at the end. And you know, what we're missing when you take out the in-person element is a lot of the more casual conversations that might be set up around an interview. And so, you know, if you think about someone coming in to interview, you might have 4 meetings set up with kind of specific topics to cover, but in between you might have lunch, right? You might grab a cup of coffee. You might do that at the end of the day, which allows you to be in a more casual environment where you're not, you know, checking a box for going through a specific topic. And so from the talent team's perspective, I would say spending more time, you know, after that initial meeting, you know, setting up another time to talk about the people that they'll meet and the likely topics they'll cover, you know, and inserting yourself in the middle of the interview process if it's lengthy, right? If it's going to be 2 weeks, hey, you know, like, let's talk about how those 3 meetings went and what the next 2 are going to look like. And that also gives you an opportunity to check in on their timing and make sure that nothing's changed. And each time that you're having those conversations, you know, you're building a relationship and learning about what's important to that person, and making sure that that's aligned with what's important for your company. And so trying to create some of that connection in a more casual nature instead of a formal interview process, I think is really key for the talent team, and also encouraging your interview panels to do the same thing, right? To not be all business all the time, and give a chance to connect with this person about their life and what's important to them in a way that is you know, maybe different than a regular interview environment, but I think it's more important at this time to do that.
Absolutely. So I'm hearing the importance of adding in that casual but still personal connection within the structured interviewing process. So actually, one of the things that we discussed a lot when preparing for this roundtable is the importance of a structured recruiting program. And what struck me during that conversation is that for both of you, it's not something that you started doing during shelter in place, but actually is a linchpin of your recruiting efforts for a long time. So I'd love to talk a little bit about why structured and programmatic recruiting processes are more important now than ever. Lynn, I'd love to start with you. Can you talk a little bit about how a rigorous and planned recruiting process at Confluent is helping you recruiters and hiring managers get through this challenging moment?
Absolutely. Structured interviews are really important for a number of reasons. I think first and foremost, it's equitable. So if you think about having a plan to interview against, what you're really doing is asking your team to apply that plan for every candidate that you're interviewing for a role. And why you do that, of course, on the end processes that you'd like to know as much as you can about this person. So you want to have a lot of different topics to cover to understand how their experience can apply. And you also provide a richer experience to that candidate that doesn't have 5 of the same questions asked, in a row. But also you're actually going to be able to compare each candidate with like data, right? You're saying, hey, I want to understand this about you, and not allowing that gut feel, or sometimes people call it the beer test or the coffee test, like I want to spend time with this person, therefore they are a fit at our company. Instead, it's based on criteria that have been determined before this person ever showed up, and it's criteria that is actually applied against each person, which then can address the bias that we all have, when we're interviewing, to say, what am I basing this opinion on? What kind of criteria am I looking to understand about this person?
Absolutely. Same question for you, Jackie. We've spoken a few times about InVision's hiring process, but I would like to dig into the best practices that have helped you hire successfully as a 100% remote company.
Yeah, absolutely. And I 100% agree with everything Lynn said. And, one of the things that, and how we've found success in building this remote environment and recruiting practice at InVision is really allowing our recruiters to build long-term relationships with our hiring managers, to build those strong relationships with the business so that they can honestly anticipate the needs, maybe even almost know exactly what our hiring managers need before they even know it. And so that has allowed us to, fill roles so much more quickly because we can anticipate the business's needs. One of the things that I also suggest if you are new to this environment is to make sure you have clearly defined job descriptions. I think that's like a tenet that you have to keep true to, because I think it's good for the interview process. It's good to understand exactly what you're looking for if you are actively sourcing, or just for your hiring manager. And then what Lynn was talking about with, interviewing processes, if you know exactly what to interview for in terms of skills and needs for the team and for the company, it helps mitigate bias as well when you just like someone because you get along over Zoom. That is a huge part of it.
I would love to dive into that a little bit more. So just having a clearly defined job description. So what goes into a clearly defined job description, and what do you need to make sure that you go through with the hiring manager during an intake meeting?
Yeah, I can take that one. So for us, we keep a template of, the basic of these are the things we all need to be successful at InVision. It's a description of, a quick and short description because no one wants to read a book. But it's, what is the company? What is the role in the team? What will you do? And what strengths do you need to bring to the table to be successful? It's very simple. I don't know, Lynn, do you have anything else you want to add?
Sure, I'd love to. And I so agree, Jackie, that, the job description and understanding what you're going after is really like the foundational to understand whether you've reached that at the end, I think that, a lot of times people will put, what you're going after into 2 camps. One is, functionally for the role, and the other is, what could be something to strive for as an employee at Confluent, in my case, generally. And so the first functional area conversation is where you drive to the criteria that you're going to bring to your team and say, we understand this is the criteria, and so this is how we're all going to drive to that information with this person, right? And the only guidelines that I have there is, try and have the must-have criteria be, 3 or 4 things, but don't make it 10 or 12, because, if you think about you have to have these things, and it would be nice if you had these other things. If your must-have criteria is so long, you will be driving to a very, very small group of people. And then when you overlay the values of the company, the mission of the company on top of that, you're going to be getting to an infinitesimal sometimes talent pool, and that can be challenging, and it can just introduce a lot of time that you are setting up to try and find that needle in the haystack. And the way in which you can mitigate against that is to really be very clear about those few things that, if you don't have them, they are not a good fit. And then having a longer list of things that would be fantastic if they also had. And when you do that, you end up opening up your talent pool, which allows you to introduce the idea of diversity of experience and background in a way that's actually meaningful. Like you have a very long list, it's very difficult to apply lens for diversity. And so, and it's a very hot topic right now, and everybody wants to think about it. But, the mechanics behind that are very important because a lot of people get knocked out in that stage applying against criteria. And then in terms of, the company, people call it fit, the culture fit, there's many ways to describe that. It's actually kind of tricky, and actually one of the ways in which bias can be introduced the most, because it's not very easy to define for some companies. And so if you allow that to be the definition, which is simply, culture fit, without an understanding of what that means or how you would apply it, then it might be up to the interviewer to make that decision versus a group construct. So for Confluent, we have a set of values that we are all very clear on, and we talk about values alignment instead of culture fit. And so we can point to a value and say, I really saw this show up, in someone. I'm excited about how much they have customer love, which is one of our values, prominent in what they do, or they came across as really humble and empathetic and in the work or in the leadership role that they have, and I can see that aligned with our values. And just being very specific about what it is, what value that was espoused or not, allows for us to really get a great picture on how they would be able to be successful at Confluent.
So I'm hearing being able to define and structure the criteria for the functional part of the role, but also understanding the values alignment leads to a more diverse process, a more equitable process, which I think is what everyone is striving to have right now. Jackie, I've heard as well that InVision has some core principles that they've created that you hire for, and especially these principles are more catered towards remote work, given that InVision is a 100% remote company. Could you share maybe 1 or 2 specific principles that you feel is especially suited for a remote employee?
Sure. Some of those principles would be humility. That's one of our main company principles, and it's something that we truly do look for in the interview process. How does that come through in their language and their storytelling? That is so important, because if you're humble, you're probably going to have a really hard time when your Wi-Fi goes out, or your kid, runs in the room, or someone has to cancel last minute. Yeah, it's just not going to work out here at InVision, or if you're in a remote capacity. One of the things that we also really look for is intelligent urgency. It's moving with speed, but also in a very small way. So you have something that comes across your desk, you ask questions, you evaluate your responsibilities and the other things that you've got going on, and then you move with speed. Those are just like a couple of examples. And I actually want to go back to something that Lynn mentioned. And Lynn, I'm sure you and I could probably have a long conversation about all kinds of things in terms of talent, but I truly do believe in terms of diversity, that having these following or having an idea of, this is such an interesting topic. So making sure you know exactly what you're looking for in terms of just like a simple JD. And then when Lynn was mentioning like company culture or company fit, making sure that you can screen out bias by having these things like humility and, intelligent urgency for InVision. But also specifically, I do believe you have to hire and source diversely. You can have so many people apply for your jobs, and they could be women, they could be people of color, they can be people from lots of other underrepresented communities. But I strongly believe that you have to actually go out and look for those people, encourage them through the process. And I also think that part of remote hiring and recruiting is properly prepping your candidates for their interviews. And if someone comes from a diverse background or from a background that is not like a tech company, but they have skills that are transferable, you're gonna have to prep them a little bit more. So that's something to really think about in terms of prepping your candidates, making sure that they're feel comfortable on Zoom, and that what's something that we call it InVision, coming through the screen, making sure that they know how to engage with people, making sure that they can kind of speak the language of the company. That's really going to help with anybody's recruiting experience or anyone's experience going through the pipeline, but especially your diverse candidates as well.
Lynn, do you agree? Have you had a similar experience with prepping all candidates, but also particularly diverse ones?
So I think it's really important to consider each candidate that you have and what they need in the process, and do the best you can, right, to allow them to succeed. I always say that interviewing is the most artificial environment that we can ever imagine, but we have not yet come up with a better way to meet someone and offer them a job. And so if we just all recognize that it's a difficult process, and also with this completely remote process, that's an even truer statement, and say, what is it that we can think about that makes that a better experience for someone, so they can be their true self, and that they can basically take the stress of the situation off to really think about questions and provide information about their experience that's relevant. And I mean, I think I can speak for everyone. I've been in interviews. You want to put your best foot forward, but there can be things that put you off that don't allow you to do that. And so we all bear some responsibility to be able to say, how did I make that experience better or not? One thing that we haven't talked about, right, in this process of making it better is who do you represent in your interview process? Because, if you are not thoughtful also on who you're putting in that interview panel, then, you are not also doing the best you can for that person to understand your entire environment. And so oftentimes that gets translated into, people of diverse backgrounds should have a diverse interview panel. And I would strongly recommend that you don't apply that you don't go seek a diverse panel for a diverse candidate, that you actually seek to show diversity in your company to every candidate, because you want to know both how they're viewing that and what their interactions are. And so in international recruiting in the past, we've had different approaches that candidates have had with female interviewers, that if they weren't on that panel with that male candidate, we wouldn't have seen that there was a challenge, that there was a different communication style between that man and that woman in that situation. And so I just want to say that we can learn a lot by putting different types of people from different teams on panels and see what's happening and use that as information. Does that make sense? And Jackie, do you think I explained that well?
Yeah, no, totally, Lynn. And I agree with you. I think it's so important, like as a woman and as a person of color, like I want to see people who look like me, because I want to feel like I have a place there and that I have people that I can relate to and can aspire to be like. But at the same time, we need to make sure that, yes, you're right. Like, if you're a man, like, you need to have a panel with women and people of color and anything and everything and all the intersectionalities of our beautiful world. I think that's so, so important. And one of the things that we also can do to help you figure that out is, if there is like an interview, it depends on how you structure your process. And then, Lynn, I don't know how you all do it at Confluent, but one of the things that you can do is maybe you have a 30 or 45-minute interview that interviews for, I don't know, you could, at InVision, we've called it InVision principles. And so you can train 40 people, 30 people, however big your team is, of anybody in the company. It could be a recruiter, it could be your CEO, it could be an executive assistant, it could be a product manager, it could be anybody. But make sure you have a diverse slate of people who are trained to do this one specific interview. And then that is a very easy way to diversify your interview panel. Because I know a lot of people have like, well, how do I include diverse, how do I have a diverse interview panel? But that is a very easy way to do it. And Lynn, I don't know, do you have a suggestion on how to create a diverse interview panel?
So it can be challenging at all companies for the exact same reason that you brought up, Jackie. It's like, well, they're not in that function, so how do we include them? And I love the idea of being able to draw from all parts of the company, right, and talk about the company, right, the company values or mission. I would also say that we were talking a little bit about structured interviewing criteria and asking people to think about the criteria that they've been asked to talk about, right, to be able to discover. But I also believe that, each interviewer can be bringing up and should be bringing up things that are important to the company, right? Because it shows kind of an alignment, right? That we're all aware of these things and this is important to us. And so I wouldn't want it to only be, to only be coming from one person, because it might feel disingenuous. And so, we think it's a whole effort to talk about, inclusive behavior and how we want people to be, really empathetic to those around them, right? So, it's kind of, important to think about how you both diversify as well as have this be a kind of shared mission, right? And have, every person, no matter their background, to talk about what's important to the company, right?
Absolutely.
What's really coming across is that in this remote environment, just as it's important to get your hiring team aligned and give them enough information to make the hire, it's important to care about the candidate experience, to make them feel comfortable to make the leap and take on a remote job during this time. Jackie, along those lines, how does InVision think about your employer brand, and what has been working for you in order to make candidates feel comfortable to accept a new job?
I think it's what we've done and what we're continuing to do is to extend empathy and grace. I think that's so important. It's really understanding your candidates' motivations and needs, being available to answer questions. One of the things, like, I have my set interview, I know exactly who I need them to meet with, the questions that I know I need my interviewers to answer and get clarity and signal on. But sometimes maybe a candidate wants to talk to a peer that wasn't on the original interview panel. Maybe they want to have a follow-up conversation. And so I think that's so important to address, to make sure that they're comfortable. And something that Lynn mentioned earlier is like those personal and kind of casual touch points. For me, I love to take a relational approach. And I think we do a lot of that in leadership hiring. It's I personally, like, I will text with my candidates if they're comfortable with it. You know, you get to a certain point in the process where you might have to like talk quickly. And so it's a text, it's a quick call. It's either me initiating that or them. But it's so, so important to open up those opportunities for those touch points to make sure that people feel comfortable. And this is a really scary and uncertain time. So as talent professionals, I think it's so, so important to make sure that you're touching base with your candidates, checking in, asking about them and their family. One of the things that we love to do at InVision, whether it's with a candidate or just like internally, is we have like the first few minutes of a Zoom call is, hi, how are you? What's going on? Pre-COVID, it's where are you located? Or with someone that you meet often or you see often, it's, oh, it looks like you're in a different place. Like, where are you? Are you traveling? What's going on? I think those little opportunities open up a lot of room for that personal touch and to make it feel a more human. And you also get to know people a little bit more. And I can kind of argue that I think I know some of my Envisioner, coworkers a little bit more than I knew I used to work at Facebook and Instagram. I think I know, Envisioners a bit more than I do my coworkers that I would see every day at work. So again, it's, being humble, being open and extending grace and empathy to people.
I completely agree. And also with specifically what you called out with leadership recruiting, there's a friend of mine who was offered a manager role during this time, but she turned it down because she thought, how am I going to go in and manage people that I've never met in person? There's definitely that feeling of helping her understand her team or meet her team in a more personal way to get that comfort to take the leap. So Lynn, as an executive recruiter, I'd love to get your thoughts on how Confluent thinks about attracting and closing candidates in today's environment.
Well, I think what Jackie called out is, when we talk about empathy in the moment, we're all living in this crazy, crazy time. And there's so many things that you could put into the crazy category. We've talked about COVID a lot, but there's many other things. And I'm going to apologize because there's a little bit of yard work. So we'll see how that goes. I've got now the dog outside the door and now some yard work. So hopefully you can still hear me okay. But I think that making sure that that candidate is aware that's a unique time and we're here to support them through this. We've talked a lot about the talent team, and the role that the talent team plays. But I will also say that the way in which you help the hiring team to connect with that candidate is very, very important. And I always say that people don't make decisions about going to new companies really, honestly, based on the role and the financial opportunity. They are making their decision based on people. What is it that they get as a signal that this is going to be a place where they're going to be well understood, that they can communicate well? There's basically, they can trust these people and what they're saying to them about the company and the role. And so, asking your interview team to send them follow-up notes. Hey, you had a great conversation. Send them an email or text them and say, thanks so much for coming in. I really enjoyed it. It goes a long way, right? And then to that end, if you are talking about, a leadership position, giving them access to that team that they'll lead to give them a little bit more insight. If you think about pre-COVID, someone might walk in and say, over there in this office is your organization. That's where they sit. Well, you're not going to have any of that, right? And so trying to give them more context about that team and more access and to take any of the question marks out, I think is really important. And then something else that Jackie said, I'll just emphasize, along the way, we're really trying to discover what's important to someone. So what would they look for to make a move and all of that. And really, I make it a practice to go back to that list with this person and say, I want to check in with you, like what we talked about that was important to you, and see how, the conversations have yielded against that list. So is it the right thing for you to do? Like, let's review it. And get them to, really verbalize like that it is or isn't. Sometimes it's not, right, the right role for them? And if it is, then say, great, let's figure it out. Let's do this together. And I think that people really appreciate that support, right? That partnership in what's a very difficult thing to do. Sometimes people don't realize that the stress of changing jobs is really, really high. Like there are horrible things that are on this high stress list that have to do with your family, right? And your relationships. And then right after that is changing jobs, because it has to do with everyone you see every day, the financial stability of you and your family. And so really recognize that I try never to forget that. And what is it that you need in this process to make you feel really comfortable, especially at this time?
I love that. So I hear there's so much that needs to go into helping candidates through the decision, being empathetic with them and giving them a realistic look into the kinds of teams that they would be joining. In the midst of this conversation, I feel like we can talk forever. We did get a lot of Q&A from the audience, so I would love to jump into that. And a lot of it is around interviewing. And Lynn, you mentioned that interviews are an artificial process, so we're finding other ways to be able to understand people better. One audience member has asked, we're seeing a trend in asynchronous interviewing, where the candidate does not meet a human being, instead they interact with the computer program. Are there best practices that you can point to in order to maximize the candidate experience in the asynchronous environment? This is for both of you.
Yeah, so I actually don't have any experience in kind of automated computer generated interviews. So I'm going to turn this one over to Jackie and see if she does.
Yeah, so thanks, Lynn. We do it's mostly for engineering though. So we use a service to kind of test a software engineer's capabilities and knowledge of different languages. And so it's sometimes it can be glitchy, to be very honest with you. So what I would suggest as a talent professional is checking in, like put a human touch on it before they interact with the software, and properly prepare them so they know exactly like what's going to happen, and then make sure you follow up after with an email or a text, depending on how close to them you already are. I think that's the best way to go about it. But I also do think that we need a little bit more time to kind of perfect those types of interview processes. Or interview interactions. They're fairly new, and so there are definitely some bugs to work out.
And another audience member asked then, what are your thoughts about work for hire on a challenge or a small project?
Lynn, do you all do that at Confluent?
So we would definitely not have someone do work that we were not paying them for. So that's just a statement. But what the question might be asking about is, kind of take home assignments, like and the ability to present on something that the candidate has had prior knowledge about, right? Here's a question and we would love to have you think about it and not have to have you think on your feet to be able to qualify for this role. And I think that that's a great way to allow for better outcome, especially for people who are maybe more introverted and would prefer to have some time, because we don't hire people only to have the right answer in the next second. Obviously a lot of work is done very thoughtfully over time. So yes, we do that, and I think it's a great way to get a richer signal from candidates on what they have experienced and what they could contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Lynn 100%. At InVision, we actually do part of our process a lot of the times is to have our candidates present a piece of past work. We call it different things in different functions of the business. So in design, it would be a past work review. So we want you to show 2 or 3 pieces of past work, whether you're an individual contributor or a leader. In engineering, it could be one of those automated, coding tests. In product management, it would be a live kind of a live demo. We would give you a prompt beforehand. If you are looking to have candidates do something brand new and from scratch, please pay them. Please pay. That's just, and have legal figure that out for you all. But you need to have a signed contract. You probably need to pay them, a little bit of money, because it's a little bit unethical to ask people to put in 10, 20 hours of work, and then, it go nowhere. I've even heard of people seeing their work being used. So please be careful about that. But I think the best way to go about it is to give them a prompt, have them think about it, and come back and do a demo or a past work review.
Thank you for that. And we have another question on a little different topic, but it's around candidates who confuse the company with another company of a similar name. And so do you eliminate candidates that haven't done their homework on the company? How do you respond to that?
I think it depends. I mean, honestly, you have some expectations for candidates who, for instance, have applied. They've seen that you have a role and they're very interested in that role. Well, one of the ways in which they express interest is by doing that homework. But many of the candidates that we talk to, we're reaching out to, we're saying, hey, you have a really interesting background. I'd like to know more about you. And to expect that they're going to do work on my behalf when I'm reaching out to them, I think is unrealistic. And I take every opportunity I can to give background on Confluent and the product space. We are defining a new, space with something that we call event streaming for real-time data. And so if they don't know about that, of course, I wouldn't expect them to. So I think it does depend.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Especially when you're talking to candidates that you've sourced and you're actively seeking. I don't always expect them to have spent an hour or two researching the company or the team. But one of the cool things that I love about Zoom or any kind of video conferencing software out there is, one of the things that I do during my interviews, I'm talking about the products or the tools or the people on the team, is in the chat box. I send links. I say, oh, here, this is the product that I'm talking about. And I send a link, and the hiring manager for the role is this person. This is our CEO. That tends to be super helpful, and people will save those links, and then they do their research based on that. So that is super helpful to get people in the know.
So last question. So ultimately, right, the talent team was working hard to create a structured recruiting process, working hard to work with the interview panel as well to have a great candidate experience. But at the end of the day, after all the interviews, the hiring manager makes the decision. So what are best practices? What recommendations do you give to help guide hiring managers to make that ultimate decision, to bring someone on in a completely remote environment?
So, first of all, I know we've used this word, maybe it's possible to overuse the word empathy, but I always make sure that the hiring leader understands the whole challenge behind that, because it can be a tough decision. And I ask them to really rely on the criteria that we set up with to begin with, right? Because that is the reason why we set that up, is to be able to know with more certainty that we have found someone that we think is going to be great for the role. And so I would say first lead with, I know this is a tough decision, but let's look at this together. And now in terms of the tactics behind how you gain the information, the feedback on that candidate, there's many different ways. And you may have live feedback sessions with a group in order to make sure that you've well understood the answers, which can sometimes be a little bit more opaque in written feedback. But overall, I would say just rely on that criteria so that you're getting away from that gut feel of who feels, right? So that you can understand what you were going after to begin with.
Yeah, and one of the things that I always like to tell my managers is in the business is, okay, 6 months from now, where does the team need to be? 9 months, a year from now, where does the team need to be? And does this person add value? Will they help the team get to that point? Where does the product need to be? And if that person is going to be the best fit, if they're going to add value to the team, that is your person. If not, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and maybe we need to, figure out the process. Maybe it needs to be a little bit more rigorous, or we need to find out more information about something specific. But if your hiring manager can answer that question, I think it's a lot easier for them to and feel comfortable to make that final decision.
Well, thank you so much, Lynn and Jackie. This concludes the thought leadership portion of this webinar. Thank you both again. We'll be sending a recording and recap of today's session to everyone afterwards. And this webinar was part of our monthly speaker series, so also look out for an invite to our October event. If the audience has any other questions for you both, hopefully they'll be able to connect with you online. Now, for those of you who have 5 minutes and want to stay on, I'll be doing a brief demo of Searchlight's platform, and many of the things that Lynn and Jackie mentioned around setting structured criteria are baked into our product. And as a hiring manager myself, I built Searchlight to give the insights that I couldn't get through interviews. So if you want, I want to give you an opportunity to hop off, but if you want to stay, feel free. I'll be doing a brief demonstration.
Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who are interested, I'll go ahead and share my screen. And as I mentioned before, Searchlight is a talent data platform that builds candidate profiles on behaviors, strengths, and soft skills from a gold standard reference process. Our platform does approach references differently than a typical reference check in that it's automated, digital, and data-driven. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of a recruiter hiring for a software engineer. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So if we're hiring for a software engineer, it's really important, as Lynn and Jackie mentioned, to set your criteria on what you're looking for up front. It leads to a much more structured process. It means that you can reduce your time to fill. And we actually baked in the ability to define those criteria for roles in a feature called Ideal Profiles. So we work with org psychologists to create a database of competencies as well as behaviors that make it easy to create this ideal profile. So things like good communication, coachable, hardworking. Also behaviors, are they more data-driven or are they more intuition-driven? Neither are good or bad, but it's simply what is your hiring manager looking for on the team that they're managing? So we define this upfront. What happens next is that we would invite candidates to Searchlight to get more signals on those soft skills, strengths, and behaviors through their past colleagues. You can invite them through their ATS, you can invite them through the platform. I'll show you the candidate experience in a moment, but just to show you the kinds of data that we get back in this situation, we've invited 4 different candidates for a software engineering role. In this case, they're stack ranked by our Searchlight score. Our Searchlight score is essentially a match score. Our algorithm takes in over 20 different inputs from the data set that we have on candidates. And then we are able to reduce bias by normalizing the influence of individual pieces of feedback based on how long they work together, as well as the level of consensus, things like that. But the higher the score, the more qualified is our recommendation for the role. So let's go into 11 Hopper. Again, this is all in the effort of being able to fill in signal that you normally wouldn't get through interviews. In this case, we can see some things like 11 strengths. So we've heard from our customers that this is the most predictive data set on what a candidate's actually like to work with, because we see individual strengths as verified by their past colleagues. And we're able to see what is this candidate's working style. So you can tell 11 in this case is more data-driven. She's more of an individual decision maker, and she's balanced between wanting a more structured environment and a more fluid environment. There's no good or bad about this, but it's just, how does this match up with what the hiring manager is looking for? And in this case, we can overlay the visualization of what is qualified for the role, and same thing here in terms of ideal strengths. Jackie mentioned things around principles that you're looking for. So we actually are able to customize behavior scores based on the values and principles that a company is specifically looking for to surface a heat map on these certain behaviors. And then on the bottom, you can see the open-ended text that you would normally expect from a reference check. And that's available as well. But we are finding that most of the hiring teams that use us really do love the data insights and summaries that we pull off to show how a candidate matches against specific criteria. This is a very brief overview of what the hiring team gets back as a way to support their ultimate hiring decision. We've also heard that candidate experience is very important. So let me very briefly show you what that looks like. In this case, a candidate is just invited to a profile. They're told what they should be inviting in terms of their references. They invite who they would like to bring in. And once they click invite, a reference actually just gets a digital form in which they are filling out certain questions in a variety of dimensions. We created this experience with org psychologists to get at balanced feedback, where there's no such thing as right or wrong. That's really around a spectrum. And that leads to the robust data profile that I just showed in the beginning. References take about 15 minutes to go through this. Candidates take about 10 minutes. So all in all, it's meant to be a pretty robust assessment that doesn't take up too much time, but makes your hiring team much more confident in making a decision. In fact, one of my customers just last week told me that I helped give him the confidence. Searchlight helped give him the confidence in otherwise low touch recruiting, virtual recruiting environment. So brief overview of Searchlight. Of course, I'm always happy to chat more. If you're interested in learning more, just email me at kerry@searchlight.ai. But thank you for attending, and we will talk soon. Look out for our email with our video and recap. Have a good rest of your day.